I had been single for what felt like forever after a few long-term relationships went nowhere in my late 20s. As I settled deeper into my 30s, friends and family constantly asked when I was finally going to find the one. I tried not to let it get me down, burying myself in my work as an HR manager at the bank. But nights could feel pretty lonely coming home to an empty apartment. On a whim, I decided to give online dating one more shot. I spent an entire weekend obsessing over my profile, picking just the right photos, agonizing over how to summarize myself in a few silly paragraphs. Part of me felt silly doing this in my mid-30s, but I kept telling myself to have an open mind. The first few weeks were a roller coaster, alternating between excitement over matches and dates, and then disheartening disappointment when things didn't click. Just when I was about to delete the apps again, I got a like from Michael. His photos immediately caught my eye. A warm, friendly smile and these kind brown eyes that seemed full of life and positive energy. His profile mentioned he worked in real estate but with an obvious passion for finding people their dream homes. There was just something magnetic about the way he talked about his career. After a couple days of exchanging messages that flowed naturally, Michael suggested meeting up for coffee that weekend. A flat white at a local cafe midway between our places. Nothing too complicated. Just two people getting to know each other over warm drinks. Simple, but it suddenly made me giddy like a teenager again. The first time I saw Michael in person, leaning casually against the brick exterior of the cafe in a pale blue button-down, it was like a cartoon heart balloon inflated in my chest. "Victoria, so nice to finally meet you," he said in a deep, reassuring voice as we exchanged an almost awkwardly long hug. I couldn't help but be a little flustered and tongue-tied at first, hoping I wouldn't say anything too embarrassing. Thank goodness Michael was such a natural conversationalist, instantly putting me at ease as we settled into our cozy corner table. "So, you're in HR? That must be interesting," he said with an bemused smile after I briefly explained my job. "Getting people's problems dumped on you all day." I rolled my eyes self-consciously. "More than you know. Why do you think my Sundays are just me, a face mask, and 2 bottles of wine?" He laughed that warm, resonant laugh. "At least you get to help people, right? Even if they don't make it easy. My day is basically just watching money move from one pocket to the next." We stayed at that coffee shop for almost 3 hours, talking about everything from careers and upbringings to our families, philosophies on life, and future dreams. With each passing moment, I could feel myself being drawn into Michael's magnetic energy and positive presence. By the time we hugged goodbye again outside the cafe, I just had this soreness deep down. I knew there was something uniquely special between us, something I hadn't felt in years. Call it the spark, or whatever cliche you want, but it felt so real in that moment, like the start of something bigger. After that first coffee date, Michael and I were pretty inseparable those next couple of months. We went on traditional dates, fancy dinners, movies, long walks exploring the city. But we also just relished in easy domesticity, like cooking meals together in one of our apartments or lounging around watching Netflix. Looking back, I realize now how quickly and intensely I was falling for this man. The way he could make me doubled over with laughing one minute, then have my heart melting over some surprisingly deep philosophical perspective the next. Michael had this quintessential ability to live totally in the present moment that I admired and continuously aspired toward. Of course, he wasn't perfect. Michael definitely catered to some old-fashioned gender roles, like persistently insisting on picking up the check no matter how much I protested wanting to split it. "A real gentleman always pays on dates," he'd declare matter-of-factly, leaning across the table with a mischievous grin after catching me trying to sneakily settle the bill. I'd roll my eyes, trying to suppress my smile. You realize we're living in the 21st century, right? Equality and all that. Oh, I'm all for equality, Michael would counter, briefly playing along. Separate bank accounts, sure. Split the mortgage, no problem. But a man has to have antiquated practices to cling to for his dignity. In moments like that, I couldn't decide if I found his earnest anachronisms more endearing or maddening, like he just time-traveled in from the 1950s sometimes. It was probably around the 2-month mark that Michael started half-jokingly referring to my place as our place whenever he'd spend the night, which, let's face it, was becoming basically every night at that point. We had toothbrushes at each other's apartments, going out clothes taking over drawers, you name it. So while I was mildly surprised when Michael brought up the idea of actually moving in together one night after we'd polished off a couple bottles of wine, I don't think I was truly blindsided. Part of me wondered if we were moving recklessly fast, but the butterflies I'd feel just locking eyes with this man made me impulsively answer before I could overthink it. You know what? Yeah, let's do it, I heard myself saying, pulling Michael into a deep kiss, intoxicated on the giddiness coursing through me. Let's freaking go for it. It's decided then, Michael proclaimed with a grin, smoothing my hair back and looking into my eyes with that warm, earnest gaze. We're moving in together. In retrospect, maybe some small part of me recognizes that pause I should have taken to more rationally assess the situation, to consider how soon this was coming into a blossoming relationship. But caught up in the throes of passionate infatuation, all I wanted was to spend every waking and sleeping moment with the man who made me feel more optimistic and alive than I had in years. Those first few months of living together were like being permanently suspended in a dream state of domestic bliss. We'd wake up languidly tangled together most mornings, sometimes lazily making love before reluctantly untangling to get ready for our workdays. In the evenings we'd take turns cooking dinner, pouring glasses of wine, and dissecting our days over candles I now kept on permanent rotation in our kitchen. But as idyllic as that cohabiting honeymoon phase was, reality inevitably came creeping back in. In retrospect, I can see now how Michael had been putting up a front those first few months, doing his best to project the image of unbothered domestic tranquility even when the first financial strain started showing. The first sign came when he got laid off out of the blue from the real estate agency he'd been with for years. When Michael broke the news, I could sense him trying to downplay it, putting on that overly blasé confidence of his. It's no big deal, honestly, he shrugged, avoiding my gaze with forced nonchalance. I've been thinking about striking out on my own for a while now anyway. You know, being my own boss, setting my own schedule, all that. Being Michael's trademark optimistic self, I figured this was just him turning a negative into an opportunity, as he so often did. Little did I know, those little cracks were the beginning of an impending disaster that none of us saw coming. Over the next few months, strange charges started appearing on our joint account out of nowhere, things like cash advances, overdraft fees, you name it. Each time, Michael would have some new semi-plausible explanation like helping out his cousin with a loan or paying off a business investment on the side. But the truth was becoming increasingly harder to ignore. Finally, after a particularly large transfer had overdrawn our checking account to an almost comical degree, putting us behind on rent, I had to force a real conversation. When I bluntly asked what was really going on with his finances, Michael's nonchalant facade quickly crumbled. His eyes took on a haunted, cornered look as it all started spilling out. Victoria, I've really gotten myself into a hole here, he stammered, struggling to maintain eye contact. A few years back, I started leveraging myself to the max, spending almost every dollar I could get access to buying up investment properties all over the city. The market was just going up, and I really thought I had an inside edge to keep riding that wave. As Michael continued to unpack the tangled web of debt he'd gotten himself into chasing his big real estate mogul dreams, I felt a pit of dread and anger open up inside me. Why was I only hearing about all of this now, after we'd officially committed to a shared life together? How could someone as supposedly financially savvy as a real estate agent have deluded himself into such reckless mistakes? What I thought was going to just be another temporary career hurdle turned into the slow-motion crumbling of everything I thought I knew about Michael and our entire future together. By the end of his money confessional, I was staring at this man through a fog of anger, disappointment, but most of all confusion. Everything we'd built suddenly felt balanced on a crumbling precipice. When Michael reached out to take my hand, I reflexively recoiled it back as waves of doubt came crashing over my heart. In the days and weeks after Michael's financial confession, I found myself slipping into an endless cycle of emotional whiplash. One moment, the part of me still desperately in love with this man was overwhelmed with the desire to help and support him however I could through this crisis. We're partners, I reasoned. Isn't that what you do when your person is going through something tough? But then, I'd revisit the startling reality of just how deeply in debt Michael had willingly plunged us when he doubled down on those toxic get-rich-quick delusions of real estate grandeur. As the shockwaves from his bombshell continued sinking in, new details and mounting bills seemed to emerge daily, numbers and figures I could scarcely wrap my head around, all pushing us deeper into a pit of uncertainty. How could I really trust someone who had embraced such reckless self-deception so completely? Rationally, I knew I had to consider protecting myself, cutting my losses with a man whose careless greed threatened to sink, not just him but anyone strapped to his sinking ship. The pragmatic voice in my head screamed at me to run while I still could, before sacrificing any more of my own financial security and well-being. But then I'd look over at Michael, that familiar warm twinkle in his eyes now dimmed with regretful fragility, and feel my resolve faltering. In quiet moments, we'd lie tangled together on the couch, his body wrapped around mine in that intimately familiar way that still made my heart swell with tenderness. In those private cocoons, Michael would speak of his mistakes in a rawly repentant tone I'd never witnessed from him before, exposing a rare vulnerability as he cautiously outlined plans to right the ship. "I'm gonna make this right, Victoria," he'd murmur into my hair, his voice thick with determination. "If you'll just stick with me, I promise I'll find a way to get us out of this mess." Part of me so desperately wanted to believe those impassioned vows, to trust in the perseverance of the man I fell so instantly head over heels for. He was still, underneath all the regrettable financial errors, the same upbeat charmer who had so effortlessly seduced me with his rosy optimism and lofty dream-chasing those first magical months. How could I turn my back on that? On him? On the life I thought we were building together? Did all that evaporate with the dark cloud of debt now looming over us? As the emotional stakes raised higher with each tense conversation, I found my own compass spinning wildly between the rational protectiveness of self-preservation and the starry-eyed infatuation that still refused to relinquish its grip on my heart. Increasingly, Michael and I were screaming soulmates and financial adversaries rolled into one. I was drowning in a roiling sea of self-doubt. Do I exit stage left or lash myself to the mast for what could be the stormiest nights of our lives? By the time I finally worked up the nerve to broach counseling, I still didn't have any clarity on which path forward was the right one. I just knew something had to give before the uncertainty tore me in two. Deciding to go to couples counseling was one of the most humbling things I've ever done. There I was, a relationship veteran who had survived plenty of breakups in the past, now swallowing my pride to sit across from a therapist and confront how hopelessly lost I felt amid this tangled mess with Michael. To his credit, Michael embraced the counseling process with the same unflappable determination he tackled everything else. If nothing else, watching him take full accountability for the situation, owning every mistake instead of making excuses, was a step in rebuilding some of the trust I had lost. "I have no one to blame but myself," he admitted somberly in one of our first joint sessions, slowly rotating his wedding ring, a nervous habit of his I'd noticed. Getting over-leveraged, chasing some ego-driven delusion of becoming a real estate mogul overnight, putting us in this hole through my arrogance and lack of discipline. I reached over and squeezed his hand tightly, a small gesture of solidarity. As difficult as it was facing our glaring flaws and immaturity in retrospect, there was also a strange energy between us in those moments, as if by confronting our worst selves head-on, we were rediscovering the unshakable foundations of partnership that made us work in the first place. Of course, talk is cheap without action. Over the following months, Michael did take concrete steps to start repairing the damage. He landed a stable union construction job, ensuring we had reliable income flowing in each week. We started budgeting for the first time, meticulously planning out how every dollar would go towards paying off debtors before anything else. The date nights, vacations, and little luxuries we once took for granted as a couple disappeared. Making major sacrifices in pursuit of digging ourselves out of that pit reinforced in me just how serious Michael was about righting his wrongs. There was an unspoken pact of mutual atonement between us, he through his daily cash penance, and me sticking by him even when the easiest path would have been calling it quits. Still, maintaining such a draining routine took its slow toll. As relieving as it was feeling like we had a plan towards salvation, the near-constant pressure of sacrifice barely gave our hearts and minds any room to breathe. Even our most intimate moments started taking on a perfunctory quality at times, like we were just going through relationships 101 choreography rather than sharing a deeper communion. Date nights became increasingly rare splurges, and when they did happen, the guilt of enjoying ourselves seemed to pervade the air, hanging heavier than the romantic ambience. Michael and I started reminding ourselves of those businessman buddies who take their annual obligatory work vacations with their wives, civil together, sure, but not necessarily connecting on a soul level anymore. By the end of the first year rehabilitating our situation, it was hard not to look in the mirror some days and wonder whether we were still the same people who had so effortlessly and passionately collided into each other's lives just a couple years beforehand. We were being forged anew, almost mechanically, through all the monotonous penance and atonement. But at what point does consistent effort cross the line into joyless drudgery? It was during one of our quarterly check-ins with the financial advisor, the first in months, where she commended our steadfast commitment while simultaneously warning of the long road still ahead of us, that the brittle truth finally started setting in, at least for me. Were we actually digging ourselves out, or just spinning our wheels in a different life's rut? When I saw the flicker of hope and optimism fade from Michael's eyes as the dire projections continued being spelled out, I felt a buckling deep inside my own spirit. It was a crisp fall evening when everything finally came to a head. Michael and I were walking home in uncharacteristic silence after another draining meeting with our financial advisor. The initial optimism we'd clung to for getting out of debt had slowly been eroded by the grinding realities of how long and arduous this process would truly be. As we approached our apartment building, I replayed the advisor's latest projections in my mind, the sacrifices and austerity measures stretching out for what could be another 5 years or more of our lives, assuming literally nothing went wrong. Wincing at the thought, I felt Michael's hand instinctively grasp mine, as if he could sense the doubts and fatigue gathering force inside me. "We've got this, Victoria," he said, forcing a reassuring smile as we stepped into the building's elevator. "If we can just stick to the plan, it'll all be worth it. You'll see." I squeezed his hand back half-heartedly, unable to shake the feeling that we were caught in a dehumanizing endurance marathon with no finish line in sight. Our finances, our dreams, our whole lives being whittled away relentlessly by the boulder of debt Michael had strapped to our backs. Over takeout cartons and boxed wine that night, I found myself slipping into an uncharacteristic silence, unable to reciprocate Michael's forced cheeriness and optimism as he persisted in pep-talking our way through this ordeal. Eventually, his words trailed off, his eyes studying me with a sort of resigned sadness. He could see it too. That light inside me was dying. "Talk to me, Victoria," Michael said softly, reaching across the sofa to stroke my cheek. "We're still in this together, right?" I felt my eyes well up as I gathered the strength to finally give voice to what I'd been grappling with for so long. "I don't know if I have it in me to keep going like this, Michael. All this sacrifice and penny pinching and living with a constant weight on our shoulders for years to come." His face fell as I pressed on, needing to finally purge the truth I'd been carrying. "You keep telling me it'll all be worth it when we come out on the other side, but at what cost? Who are we even becoming along the way to that mirage?" Michael opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off, finally allowing all my fear and despair to erupt. "The woman I'm morphing into, she's not me, Michael. She's a husk, a shadow of the vibrant, optimistic person I used to be before your mistakes dragged us into this pit. I can't keep living like this, not knowing if my soul will still be intact by the time we make it to the clearing." The wounded look in Michael's eyes nearly broke my resolve, but I had to keep going, knowing this was the most self-preserving thing I could do for myself now. "I'll always love you," I said, tears streaming down my cheeks as I took his hands. "But I'm realizing now that sometimes love alone can't be enough to keep sustaining two people indefinitely." In that moment, I could see Michael's spirit breaking alongside mine, the inevitability of our paths diverging setting in. He tried pleading once more to ride it out together, but the spell had been broken. My choice was made. As painful as it was, untangling our lives over the following weeks allowed me to rewake the resilient, self-sufficient part of myself that had gone into hiding throughout this tumultuous chapter. While it wasn't easy regaining my footing as a fully single woman again, I took solace in the affirmation that I had reclaimed my sense of self-worth over incremental financial sacrifices. Michael and I avoid each other's paths these days, not out of animosity, but simply because the pain still feels too fresh. In quieter moments, however, I've mustered the objectivity to appreciate how this experience was the wake-up call I needed to clearly define my boundaries and priorities going forward. I emerged from the wreckage resolute in never again compromising my core values and identity for someone else's idea of compromise or partnership. While the memory of our once blissful romance still tugs at my heart, I carry deeper pride in finally finding the courage to rescue myself before it was too late. They say love stories are written in the stars, but they fade to make way for new constellations eventually. I'm simply grateful this one taught me to never lose sight of my own guiding light within. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel, give us a like, share our story. I'll see you soon with another captivating story.